Hello, everyone, and hello to everyone online. So thank you so much for that introduction. So, yep, as you said, talking about walking in public transport and around this sort of first and final leg. My name is Holly Smith. I'm a public transport planner from Auckland Transport. And I'm here not just as myself, but really as a representative of my team at Auckland Transport. We're called Service Network Development. And we do a whole range of public transport planning. So from the day-to-day stuff happening tomorrow in the network for buses, to sort of long-term planning, making sure that when we do development plans in 20 years, that they embed public transport thinking from the very beginning. And I'm here to talk to you about pedestrians and why we as public transporters care quite a lot about them. And there is a fundamental truth that everyone in the room and online will be well aware of, that everybody is a pedestrian at some point on the transport network, no matter what mode really you're on. And I find that sort of Jarrett Walker, who's quite a well-known public transport planner, puts it really quite well, a way to reframe thinking about buses and public transport. So buses are like pedestrian fountains, throwing people out into the city centre. I also recently heard a really nice way of framing it, where someone said public transport is an extension of the walking trip. I believe one of Alan's presentations actually introduced that to me, and I thought it was such a lovely way of reframing that sort of experience. So it's a bit of a duh moment that the choices we make as public transport planners are instrumental to the pedestrian experience, and vice versa. The better we can make that experience, the more people are likely to catch our services, which is exactly what we want to do. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more high level about three different sort of things. So the first is sort of around some of the station design stuff that we've been looking at. Some stuff about network planning, a little view into the brain of a bus nerd. And also some of the work that we've been doing looking at the sort of environments around our stations to make sure that they're accessible for everyone. But to start off with, I wanted to acknowledge one key thing, that a customer sort of journey is door to door. I think a lot of times people think about public transport and they just think about the bit on the bus. And so I find this breakdown is really quite useful. So there's three sort of different components of the trip. The first being the catchment experience. That's the bit from your front door to the bit where you catch a service. And that bit where you're walking and sort of cycling or whatever it happens to be, we call the first and final leg. The stop or station experience is that sort of interface between your area and the service that you're catching. It's the point where you sort of transfer, you wait for services, you board the service. And so when we're coming to the pedestrian experience, considering that is also really quite key. And then the network experience is that standard thing people think of the time you spend on public transport services, whether that's one leg or more. And so first topic, or first section, talking about some of the stuff that we've done around stations. So last year, my team finished a piece of work called the Rapid Transit Study. And what rapid transit is it's basically our premium public transport services. So they tend to be separated from traffic, so they're uncongested and reliable, they're high capacity, and they tend to be fast and frequent. So in Auckland, we've got about 60 currently stations across that network, growing to 80. It's our train networks, our busways, and our ferries as well, included within that. And so the Rapid Transit Study sort of looked at all these stations and did a bit of a sort of data-driven assessment, set what good looked like and assessed all the stations, and was able to get a good picture of what things looked like across the network. And it looked at things from a transport access piece, from a land use and a station experience piece as well. And one of the key findings was that walking was the second highest efficiency for most stations, with poor walking scores at most stations. So only 14 of the 60-ish existing stations got a score above 60 out of 100. And to give you a bit of context, we were aiming for 80 to 100 for most of these stations. So it really gives a picture of how much further we've got to go. But rather than keeping it doomy gloomy, I thought I'd sort of show you what happens when we get it right. So this is Panmure Station. It's a really key transport hub in Auckland. It connects a really key part of Auckland called East Auckland through to the rail network into the city centre. So in 2014, the station was upgraded with a real focus on improving public transport and active mode connections. You can see the difference there in the before with a massive roundabout made to sort of have wide cross sort of active mode connections and better crossings, better connections to the town centre. And doing this was really effective. So in a year, it went from under 300,000 passengers to over 400,000 passengers. So a 56% increase in patronage in a year. And it's now our third busiest train station across the network. So when we get it right, it's really good. And the second thing I sort of wanted to cover was network design. So what sort of things are we thinking about when we're looking at planning routes? And when we're looking at the first and final leg and the pedestrian experience, and how that influences network design, the key piece is access. And as sort of public transport planners, when we're thinking about access, we often have a intense balance game between frequency, which is how often your service turns up, and coverage, which is basically how much ground is your network covering. It's sort of the difference between a bus turning up outside your door every hour, or walking 5 minutes for a bus that turns up every 10 minutes. And an accessible network is a balance of these sorts of routes. And to give you a little bit more of a view of some of the other things that we're balancing when we're looking at things, these are some of the core design principles for our network in Auckland. Again, around that frequency being really key. Our network is based on sort of connectivity. So we have services that tend to be more frequent and rely on transfers. And it allows much more connectivity to more places across the network and more direct journeys. And also simplicity. So our network needs to be accessible, not just for people who've been commuting their whole lives, but even if you've just started yesterday. And in the words of David Hilson, basically these principles together enable more access to more destinations for more people more often. So our job ends up being like the little blue man in the corner there, sort of desperately trying to balance all these different things to get the best outcomes that we can for people. And often there's no right answer, just the best one that we can do. So I had a chat to our team, and I sort of said, what examples of network design can you give me that sort of show you some of these things applied and how we think about this when we're implementing things? And so Sean gave me the route 191, which is the route there on the pink. And when you look at this route, you might think, what on earth? That doesn't match any of the principles you've just told me you follow. It's not simple. It's not direct. But what this route does is it connects some really key sort of places within the community, 2 town centres, a retirement village, a metropolitan centre, train stations. And so the connectivity and access that route enables is really important for those communities. And it's quite a different route. Dave gave me a route called the 883. It connects one of those rapid transit stations I was talking about to an area called Schnapper Rock. And I like it because it's quite an example of how small decisions in network design can make quite a big impact. So you'll notice there at the end of the route, it's got a loop. And that loop goes in an anti-clockwise direction very specifically. So in that bottom image, you'll see there at the south, there's an empty green space. So by making that loop anti-clockwise, it means that all of those bus stops are on the side of the houses. And it basically means that that catchment of the route is maximized. We've limited all those crossings that people have to make, and the route is far more accessible for those communities around it. And it is those minor things can make quite a big difference overall. And the third piece I wanted to talk about was this, ensuring access for all users. So it's a question that we need to ask ourselves and sometimes gets left off. How do we make sure that the places we're putting our stops and our stations are accessible? Because we know not all pedestrians look the same, and their needs are different for everyone across the network. And so I wanted to highlight this really awesome piece of work that we'd done this year, which fell out of that rapid transit study I was talking about. Basically, it's a program that you can use that allows you to virtually walk through Street View, and you label a whole bunch of different accessibility issues across the network. So you can highlight things like surface problems, obstacles in paths, missing curb ramps, missing tactiles, and sort of label that across the network. And we were able to trial it for the first time in New Zealand at 5 of our stations to see what it was like, how applicable and useful it was, and what was the scale of the problem. And here's a view. So this is Papatoetoe. It's a station on one of our train lines. And every single dot there on the map is some sort of barrier to a user. And so it gives you an idea of just the scale of issue that we have. So we're hoping to use this as a little bit more information so that when we're going to try and get funding for these things, or someone needs to know the scale of the problem that we have, that's it. It's big. And while it may not make much of a difference to someone like me or someone who's able-bodied, it makes a big difference to others. And just to wrap up, I thought I'd sort of end it by talking about some of the challenges that we face. And these are sort of three of my favorite ones that constantly come up. So number one is empty buses. Whenever, so a lot of things often we get is someone sees a bus and there's only 5 people on it and they go, oh, it's useless. Why do we run this route? It's not cost effective. What a waste. But I'd bring up the example of the 191 that I talked about, where it does all those important connections, where people might only be using a segment of the route. So while you only see 5 people on that bus at a time, each run could have 30 or more people using it. There's also the thing around, you know, the accessibility that provides, that option it provides, that it's really important sometimes to have routes like that may look empty, but are really important. The second one, as you've probably heard, our job is a bit of a balancing game. And trying to do this is always really difficult. I find that generally if you're getting yelled at by both sides, you're probably doing a decent job. And so trying to get this can always be a little bit tricky. And the last one is big, ugly buses. Of course, I think that buses are beautiful, but I know not everybody else does. And that's the thing, that we have these important town centres, that we need these people in buses to get there. The issue is then we get the buses there and we've got to find places to put them. And so having that constant struggle of where do we put the out of operation services? Where do we put the bus stops? How do we integrate them? Is a constant struggle. And so if we've got any urban planners in the room, I'd put a call out, please work with us, because the people in buses are so important, and allowing the space and integrating public transport services is really, really key to having an accessible city. So that wraps me up. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.